welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Makbul with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be taking a look at the developments in the Supreme Court today and the decision that has been announced regarding the petition that the PTI had filed concerning ACP's announcement of Punjab polls and the new date of October 8th. This has been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, then claiming that the elections need to be held as per the Constitution and is given the new date of May 14th as the elections to be held in the Punjab province, and something of course that needs to be carried out in terms of the finances and security concerns that were earlier raised by the ECP and the coalition government as well. As part of these proceedings, of course, there were a lot of issues and discussions that took place surrounding not just this particular decision, but in fact what has been going on within the courts, the formation of the benches and the powers of the CJP. In all of these developments, we saw that the institution itself came under question a lot in terms of the kind of procedures that needed to be carried out, and then of course with regards to its role in line with the parliament and the political powers as well. And this is something that has been commented on as a response to today's verdict as well, claiming that perhaps the constitution regarding the 90-day limit and the fact that the elections need to be held after the assemblies are dissolved is something that was more straightforward, but the lesser straightforward question still remains unanswered in terms of what is going on within the judiciary and how exactly will now this unfold, which some are saying will increase the kind of crises that exist now within the judiciary, and both with the judiciary and the parliament as well. Of course, the decision has been rejected by the current political setup in a federal cabinet meeting also, and then in the National Assembly we heard the Prime Minister also drawing parallels with the judicial murder of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto on this day back in 1979 as well. And this is important in terms of how moving forward the credibility of the judiciary is going to be established in line with the kind of political and economic crisis that the country is facing. So we'll take a closer look at the developments of today's legal proceedings and of course try and understand them in light of the ongoing crises within the country. We're also going to be taking a look at the bench that was formed regarding the decision coming out from Justice Qazi Faiz Isa, which was then closed by a 6-member bench. Again, something that the government is pointing towards, considering of course that there was a lot of discussion regarding the powers of an administrative order over a judicial order, and then the response that Justice Qazi Faiz Isa, of course, in the aftermath of which we saw that the registrar was then removed by the federal government. Again, this is something that is being pointed out as the responsibility of the Chief Justice of Pakistan to ensure harmony within the judiciary and make sure that all the judges are on the same page. So we're going to take a look at that particularly as well, and the pressures that now exist on the Chief Justice and the Supreme Court. For this and more, as always in the studios, I've been joined by senior analyst Farooq Batafi, who's also been joined today in the studios by Umer Ijaz Gilani, who's a legal expert. We've been joined on Skype by Barrister Azmat, Advocate Supreme Court, and we'll be joined soon on telephone line by Amanullah Kanrani, who's a former president, Supreme Court Bar Association. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being a part of the discussions today. Let me start with you, Umer, because of course we want to understand what exactly happened, and a lot of the legal experts and their opinions have been coming in. More or less, they are similar in terms of their opinion regarding the fact of the decision around the elections to be held as per the Constitution. But in terms of the other questions that are, of course, trying to be answered within this parameter as well, it seems that perhaps the case is far more complicated than it seems.
So I want to start with summarizing the decision that the Supreme Court has given today, or one would say a 3-member bench of the Supreme Court has given. The decision is that the Election Commission's earlier decision to carry out the elections in October has been struck down as unconstitutional. But going further, the Supreme Court has effectively laid down an election schedule of its own, which will culminate with a polling in the province of Punjab in the middle of the 5th month of this year. So somewhere in the middle of May is the date that the elections will be carried out according to the orders of the Supreme Court's 3-member bench. The Supreme Court has also given very detailed directions about how the elections will be conducted. So, orders of a logistical nature. For instance, the court has said that in its view, the elections will require approximately 20 billion rupees, and those 20 billion will now be disbursed from the provincial, from the budgets of the federal and provincial governments to the Election Commission of Pakistan. The Supreme Court has also delegated some of the authority that vests in the provincial government to the Chief Secretary and the Inspector General. There is a paragraph which seems to suggest that the authority of the caretaker government will be at least partly exercised by the Chief Secretary and the IG of the police in the Punjab, and if they fail to carry out the orders, they will be held responsible. So, it is a pretty detailed sort of an order which is both legal and logistical in nature. It's sort of an unusual order because we don't often find judges passing orders which, when you read it, seem to be of an administrative and logistical nature, where they detail that this is how much money that will be spent, these are the guys who will be in charge of the operation, and so on. And this is the date on which on which the elections will be conducted, and so on and so forth. There are two controversies surrounding the judgment that has been issued today. Firstly, is that does the Supreme Court have the jurisdiction to effectively carry out the elections on its own? But the second controversy, which is perhaps which is perhaps more serious, is that whether this judgment can be considered as a judgment of the Supreme Court of Pakistan or not. And this is a very serious, I don't make this statement lightly, because the Honorable Supreme Court of Pakistan, when it started hearing this issue, comprised of a 9-member bench, and then one after the other, for one reason or another, the judges either started recusing or they started being removed from the bench. So, at the end of the day, the bench came down to a grand total of 3 justices, and the question remains whether the voice of these 3 justices can be considered as the voice of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. Of course, the Honorable Chief Justice was presiding over this bench, and clearly they were of the view that they are speaking for the court. But there are reasons to believe that not the that perhaps the majority of the Supreme Court does not share that view, and I think that controversy. So, I don't think anybody in the country is saying that we don't need elections. But what most people, other than a certain political party and a few justices, seem to believe is that we cannot have fair and democratic elections in this country without fair and impartial and neutral institutions. And the only way the confidence of the electoral stakeholders in the system and in the institutions of this country could have been restored is if a full bench of the Supreme Court of Pakistan had sat and heard and decided. That is what the many of the parties before the Supreme Court were also pleading. But for reasons which escape me and perhaps other commentators in this show can help us out, for some reasons the Honorable Chief Justice decided not to bring the full weight of the Supreme Court to bear on this pressing question about the future of this country.
Right. Let me take Barrister Harris's opinion on that as well. Barrister Harris, regarding, of course, the bench formation and what has happened in the past few days. Of course, we had the Prime Minister also claiming this to be tantamount to what has happened back 44 years ago in terms of course, the kind of arguments that have been presented by the Law Minister and the Federal Cabinet. It seems that this was not something that they're happy with, of course. But in terms of what Mr. Umer was talking about regarding whether or not this will be taken as a Supreme Court judgment, because of course at the end of the day, whether or not it was the full court or a 5-member bench or a 3-member bench, this is something that has come out from the Supreme Court. How exactly will this play out in terms of its acceptance as a Supreme Court judgment, as a Supreme Court order, and what sort of actions can be taken to challenge that?
There are two issues here. One is that if whether one likes the judgment or not, one can criticize the judgment. The other one is whether this is a judgment of the Supreme Court. There is no doubt in my mind that this is a judgment of the Supreme Court presided by a three-member bench of the Honorable Supreme Court. Uh, this was heard over a period of few days. Nobody has questioned that, there have been questions, there have been arguments that a full court should have been formed, but the Honorable Chief Justice, in his discretion, and this is his absolute power as of today, to whether form a larger bench or a full bench, as the case may be. Under normal circumstances, extremely complicated cases can be heard by a three-member bench. So this three-member bench has heard the case and has decided the case. In terms of Article 189 of the Constitution, when a Supreme Court decides a case, that judgment becomes binding on all, and then one can always criticize the judgment, but there is no other option in my mind as a lawyer that we have to bow before the judgment and we have to agree with the judgment. There are cases every day when we have fantastic cases, but we lose those cases, and sometimes we're not able to persuade the judges. But there is, but there, but this, except the option of a review, there is no other option in my opinion. If the system has to work and if the system has to go on, we have to respect the judgments of the Supreme Court. Having said that, that this is a judgment of the Supreme Court, there is also a question whether initially the matter was started off with a 9-member bench and then it dwindled down to a 3-member bench. In that context, as you've also mentioned in your introduction, there is a 6-member bench judgment also today, which has been presided over by Justice Ijaz. That 6-member bench judgment has also clarified some aspects and has also clarified this aspect that the Chief Justice still has the power and the court still has the power to take suo motu actions, and it is still the prerogative of the Chief Justice. Although the situation is not ideal, there is a clear divide between two sets of judges. There are judges which believe that the suo motu power has not been validly exercised, and this is a case which probably should have been heard by the high courts. But there is another set of judges which believe that, headed by the Honorable Chief Justice, that the matter is a fit case to be heard by the Supreme Court, and it has been heard. But what is an interesting aspect in all this is that no Supreme Court judge has as yet ruled that elections should not be held within 90 days, because the Constitution in this matter is very clear that there can be no two ways about it. And but the another unfortunate aspect in all this is these are some of these questions are not legal but political. As Mr. Gilani was also pointing out, that some of the directions are administrative and very kind of micromanaging the election process. In an ideal situation, this should have never been done by the Supreme Court and should have been done by the relevant executive authorities. But at the end of the day, it seems, according to the Supreme Court, that the relevant executive authorities are not willing to perform their own functions, and hence the Supreme Court, to safeguard the Constitution, has to step in. One can certainly hope and pray that our democracy can mature and develop to a day where all these issues can be debated on in the Parliament. Like, there is a strong argument by the government, which makes a lot of sense as well, that elections should be held in one day. But that only has that has no legal solution to it. That only has a political solution to it. That the political parties can sit together and save the exchequer a lot of money, and the system and the election process could be a lot more transparent if the provincial and the national assemblies could be done on the same day. But
Right.
since the politicians are not willing to sit together, someone has to take that decision. Unfortunately, in this case, it was the Supreme Court. I also agree with Mr. Gilani on to an extent. If you take my personal opinion is that yes, a might of the full court should have decided these questions, so that whatever the right now we have 15 judges, whatever the majority of the 15 judges, 8 makes the majority in this case, decide would be the law of the land. However, the Chief Justice, in his discretion, decided not to do so, but that in his own right, that's also an absolutely legally valid exercise of discretion. Because the law as it stands today, it's the discretion of the Chief Justice. You can't compel the Chief Justice to make a bench of one's own choice. We have to believe and respect the system, that all judges are honorable, all judges are independent. As lawyers fighting litigants cases, we
Right.
cannot even think about
Absolutely.
objecting onto the integrity of a judge.
Right, and Barrister Harris, I understand the distinction that you're drawing with regards to respecting the system, but of course that system itself is being put under question, and I would like to talk further about how exactly will that play out both within the legal quarters and the political domain that you mentioned. But Farooq, in terms of the aspects that are being highlighted, of course, is not just the matter of the constitution regarding the 90-day time period or the elections. It's also, of course, what is being exercised within the judiciary, and then, of course, how this is going to play out both within the judiciary and the parliament, as both of our legal experts have pointed out regarding the very large administrative aspect of the judgment as well. And this is, of course, something that the current political setup is also pointing at in terms of the political intervention of the courts. But in terms of the way that the judicial matters are now going to play out, or the responsibility of the Chief Justice to ensure harmony within the judges, and then, of course, the parliament and the judiciary acting in harmony, how exactly will today's verdict impact that, irrespective of the election date?
Right, Sanam, before today I used to think that we are perhaps, and by the way, forgive me for all these movie and television references, because people like me who have actually been part of the autism spectrum, they tend to have this problem that they have to associate everything with ideas which are pre-cooked, or for that matter, things that are there. So I end up using very popular references, forgive me for that. But regarding what is happening right now, I used to think that we are a part of some kind of telenovela or soap opera. But today has actually brought home one reality to me, that we are part of a sitcom. And not only a sitcom, it is a dark comedy, but again, humor is humor. The way things have been going so far, I mean, today we are going to actually call it a bright day, even though it is April 4. The judgment was reserved yesterday, and somehow the Honorable Court decided and thought that it is best that it comes out today. Today is also the anniversary of Bhutto's hanging. I think anybody who was celebrating, or who was, well, my like-minded people who thought that perhaps this fight was about elections, they must be celebrating today, because immediately after that there was a 6-member bench that was constituted, and that actually struck down Qazi Faiz Isa's judgment. With all that said, it is clear that it is a power grab, and the power grab will continue. But my problem is that it is too premature to actually declare victory for anyone, because month of April, and the fight was not only about holding the elections, it was about holding the elections either within April, or actually ensuring that all the groundwork is done within April. I don't know what exactly is that that actually entails, but there are certain retirements by the end of the month. So before that, those retirements, something had to be done. I think that today ensures that everybody who kept on thinking that this fight was the right fight is vindicated and feels happy, because on one side, these judges, they have actually started attacking their own colleagues who disagreed with them, and then we saw the matter of registrar being given a stay as well. So it is clear what exactly is going on. We can, hide everything in niceties. So I am going to pretend, because in April, of course, whatever the court said will happen. But in May, whatever happens, I think that is not clear. And there is going to be some very interesting kind of dynamic that is going to shift things. But I am going to pretend today that they have won. Another party that has won today and seems jubilant is PTI. And by actually endorsing today's decision, they have actually endorsed the decision 1 year ago that was actually given at the stroke of midnight, when the courts were open during night, and at that time Imran Khan's consequently government was actually brought down. So PTI should be celebrating it. Congratulations, you have something there to celebrate. But then I will keep on pretending that everything is hunky-dory. Let us say that in the 120 days are now the new definition of 90 days. Because the elections are going to now take place on 120th day, not 90th. And earlier Barrister Sahab was saying that we should be actually bowing before the bench or judgment, I forget which. But I was told and I was raised that one should never bow before false gods. So I'm not going to do that.
Right. And Umer Sahab, while Farooq pretends, let's just try and focus on what is going on realistically, because I'd like to see things how they are and try to understand what it is in terms of what's going on. Let me clarify the jurisdictions as well as what is being pointed out, because it seems that whatever is being talked about now within the parliament or within the federal cabinet points towards a blatant violation perhaps of the judiciary in terms of intervention in political matters. Is that really something that has actually been carried out or can legally be proceeded against? Because of course at the end of the day, when we talk about protecting systems, it seems that the jurisdictions of each institution is also important, and every time we hear that somebody or some state institution has crossed the line. Is that something that has happened today?
So I think that's an allegation which at least one of the sides to one of the parties to the Supreme Court case that has been decided today is saying. But I want to make a larger point here, which is while I do bow before the Supreme Court of Pakistan and also before the Chief Justice, the authority of the Constitution is not just a legal document. It is a document that is obeyed by the people because of its moral authority. And the Supreme Court likewise is obeyed by all the other branches of the state and also by the political parties, not just because it exercises the power of contempt. The Supreme Court in our system is supposed to be obeyed because it enjoys moral authority over all the others. The parliament wields the purse and the executive wields the sword, but the judges wield only the power of the unquestionable morality, the unimpeachable integrity. And there are now serious questions about the integrity of some of the members of the Supreme Court, and I'm not the one who will be so impertinent as to say that. There are justices in the Supreme Court who have themselves written to the Supreme Judicial Council to point out that these aspersions about the integrity of at least one of the justices need to be cleared. So, these questions are only natural to arise. Nobody is saying, and I as a lawyer least of all would say, that we should not obey the judgment of the Supreme Court. But as somebody who has been a student of constitutional law for more than a decade, I also know that in a system which is ours is a system based on separation of powers. And the beauty of a system like this is that no institution is ever able to become authoritarian. So if elections have been happening in this country when both the leading political parties and the Supreme Court and the Election Commission and the permanent bureaucracy, which includes the civil service and the military services, all came together and decided that let's have the elections. Something as complicated as the elections, I really don't see how they can happen with just 3 justices of the Supreme Court and one political party saying let's make it happen. Elections in a system based on separation of powers cannot happen successfully unless there is a consensus amongst political power bearers that this is the right thing to do and this is the time to do it.
So you think that the elections will still, the decision can still be violated and the elections will not be held?
I bow before the Supreme Court and its wisdom, and I wouldn't so much as imagine that the elections should not happen on that day.
But you are imagining.
But I am saying that the system based on separation of powers, where judges do not have executive authority, In a system like this, moral consensus and political consensus is extremely important. And unless we are able to forge that sort of a consensus, we will not be able to steer this country out of its present problems. I do not question the intentions of the three-member bench, but I do feel that they may have lost sight of this very important fact, that you can't run a country without a wider political and moral consensus.
But that doesn't exist.
That has to be forged, and I think it is the Supreme Court which should take the lead, and they could have done it with a full bench. I hope that there is still, chance for course correction. If the Supreme Court cannot put 15 justices together to agree about what is the future course for this country, how do you think competing political forces can be brought to agree on that?
Right, and Farooq, I was just going to come to you because the thing is the court hasn't constituted the full court bench, and so the responsibility that Umer Sahab is pointing out hasn't really been fulfilled in that sense. So what now?
No, but I think that the Supreme Court, of course, because Umer Sahab is, not doubting the intentions of the three judges. I might not agree, but of course, he actually doesn't see anything awry. So what I'm going to say is that the bench has actually taken strides in building consensus. Like if I go back to my home and if I start shouting at my dependents and they get along, that is also a manner of forging consensus, right? At this moment, it seems that it is clear that national interest is secondary to the interest of tribal justice system within the court itself. The way our three-member bench has actually ensured, and by the way, amazing examples are there, right? Earlier it was said that suo motu issue has been clarified, that it is only the Chief Justice who can take the suo motu, and nobody else can do it because he is the master of the roster. So if it is a services tribunal case of Dogar and Justice Muzahar Ali Naqvi is sitting there, and he calls in the Chief Election Commissioner of Pakistan, that is not suo motu, that is not wrong. But if Qazi Faiz Isa actually takes up a matter, that becomes illegal. So I'm sure that this relativity of objectivism is something that is going to actually impact the country's future. But I tell you again also that no matter what we do, we have been arguing. Weeks ago, I told you about this saying in Punjabi, "Char kitabot tar lathiyan nalik latha diga," right? Four books descended from the sky, and then also our rod. Char kitabah kuch na kita digge kita sida. Four books didn't do anything, and then the rod had its way. So my humble submission is that we are part of the four books, and we have been arguing repeatedly for the Honorable Court to keep on seeing some light or some argument that we are making. They didn't, so the matter is out of our way. Now the May will decide what happens in May, not you or I.
All right. Barrister Haris, the aspect of moral responsibility and credibility as being the power of the Supreme Court and the judiciary, as Umer Sahab was pointing out, is important. But in terms of course, what you earlier said, I understand what you're saying in terms of what the law stands as today and what sort of decisions have been taken and how it needs to be respected as Supreme Court decision. But in terms of questions about its moral credibility, do you think that has been damaged within what has happened in the past week or so, considering, of course, the way that the certain quarters have reacted also outside of the political domain and in the general public as well? Has that put that power of the judiciary under question?
Unfortunately, yes. And this was bound to happen when the country is so polarized and the views are so polarized. You speak to one set of politicians, they are hailing the decision. You speak to the other set of politicians, they are absolutely criticizing the decision. As I've already mentioned, when the Supreme Court is asked to answer political and legal questions, which are more political than legal, this is bound to happen. And this is unfortunate. But as I've already mentioned, even the moral authority might erode with certain quarters. As the Constitution of Pakistan stands, there is no doubt we can criticize the judgment, but we cannot criticize this fact that the judgment cannot be obeyed. And so this is where, to me as a lawyer, the matter ends, that when the Supreme Court has interpreted something, so my and your opinion doesn't really matter. And this is how it has been in all around the world, and this is how it has been in Pakistan, and this is how it should be. Having said that, whether the moral authority is eroded or not, that's also a very subjective question, and it's also who you speak to. There are people who are celebrating the judgment and are saying that the constitution has been upheld. There are the government is of course criticizing it heavily, that this is not a judge. This is at times is a biased judgment and should have been given by a full court. There has been a consistent demand of the legal profession to formulate rules in terms of how cases are fixed and how benches are made. This is something that I believe, as a lawyer, as an officer of the Supreme Court, has been lacking. And this is something that should be addressed by a full court of the Supreme Court, maybe on the administrative side, and resolve these issues, because these issues these kind of infighting should not come out in the judgments of the Honorable Supreme Court. And as you've pointed out, which in turn, in the longer run, erodes the public confidence into the institution. These are the very same judges which give death sentences, which give sentences of acquisition of your property. So if they see that the government or others are not agreeing or not complying with the judgments, so maybe an entire village can come up and stand that we won't comply with the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court. So that doesn't leave us in a good situation.
Barrister Harris, I understand the aspect that you're raising in terms of compliance of Supreme Court verdicts and judgments, but in terms of the question marks that are being raised are of course raised in terms of the integrity of the judiciary, and to be able to respect that, because of course if there is integrity, then the Supreme Court judgment needs to be complied with, irrespective of whoever disagrees with it or criticizes it. And I want to understand in terms of the voices of dissent, both within the judiciary and outside, having a credible opinion or a valuable input in terms of what the system or the constitution says. Is that not something that needs to be allowed space for the judiciary to be strengthened?
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct. And this is an ideal time for reflection within the legal circles and with the government as well. The government to maybe reform the entire system, from the appointment process to how our legal system is handled. As you've heard, that there are reports that maybe out of 150 countries surveyed, we are at somewhere at 130. And I don't doubt that we are at so low, because our legal system is broken. And this current divide amongst the top judges of the country has not done any service to the already broken legal system that we have. But this should be a good starting point, not just to criticize, but make some constructive criticism by the government to reform the entire system, including appointments to the Supreme Court. Right now, there is such a divide amongst the different opinions that we've not been able to appoint two judges, which seat has been vacant for a long time. And when we just don't need 17 judges, we probably need 30 judges in the Supreme Court because of the backlog. And where a simple Allah Ditta's case has not been heard for years on end. So that is something that also needs to be looked into now. Once the Supreme Court and their actions are under the radar, there are lots of things which can be reformed, and this could be a good starting point.
All right. With regards to whenever we talk about change, it seems that unfortunately we end up talking about reforming entire processes, and that seems to be a much larger question. And in terms of course, the intangible measures, it can be talked about in many shoulds, but in terms of actual steps being taken to change that, we boil it down to a lot of micro steps that perhaps need to be taken, and each one seems to be a huge step forward in terms of the hindrances that exist. Justice. Even when we talk about the formation of the committee regarding the Chief Justice's powers, that bill, of course, is again something that there wasn't something that was very smooth, and is probably not going to be something smooth overhead as well, in terms of the challenges that can be made by the apex court as well. So how exactly will we even proceed forward if all we're left with is reforming the entire process or the entire institution? Yes, Umer sir.
So, I mean, I think maybe because I am hopelessly optimistic by temperament, I see that there is a silver lining in what is happening. So I am not particularly, I'm not despondent about what is happening in this country and in the Supreme Court right now. I see a ray of hope there. Why do I say that? Because the question about the moral and political authority of the Supreme Court is a question that started arising in 2016 and 17. It's not this. It now is not the first time that very important and major stakeholders in this country perceive the Supreme Court's Chief Justice and the benches deciding constitutional cases as biased. That is something that started happening in 2017 and 18 and has remained that way. What is different now is that there is now a group of conscientious dissenters within the Supreme Court who have very courageously and bravely voiced that note of dissent in public. And I think this was the necessary course correction which we needed to bring our Supreme Court back to a neutral arbiter of constitutional disputes, not a subservient institution that is doing the bidding for one political force or another. This is in some ways, the pain that happens when you start carrying out surgery. Senior puisne justice Qazi Faiz Issa has gone out of his way and risked his reputation, his career, his own family to bring about that change. And what we are now seeing is actually a turning of the tide, in my view, where the doubts that have been cast on the judiciary since 2016 and 17 are now being taken seriously, and the judiciary is making an internal reform effort to stem the rot and to remove that cancer and to bring that purity and integrity of institutions back. So I see a ray of hope here. The system of separation of powers, remember, is not a pretty one. It doesn't happen smoothly. In a system based on separation of powers, course correction happens because of infighting between institutions. When one institution transgresses into another, it can only be brought back through a forceful pushback. What we saw recently with the Parliament legislating on the issue of constitution of Supreme Court benches is an example of a progressive legislation. It represents a pushback against judicial arbitrariness. So the bars have been consistently urging the Supreme Court to constitute rules about bench formation. But when that didn't happen through internal reform, another institution of the state, the Parliament, stepped in and has pushed us closer to that direction. So it may not look like a pretty fight, but this fight is perhaps essential to take our democracy forward and to deepen the roots of this constitutional system.
Absolutely, and I understand that, and I'm glad that there is a better way to look at things. But Farooq, in terms of the possibilities that exist through this infighting, is it also not a possibility that we can be led into chaos?
Right, I agree with Umer Saab that he is hopelessly optimistic. And I say this because I don't see that kind of silver lining anywhere. Earlier, Barrister Saab was pointing out that these judges are going to hear other cases of very great importance, like that might decide people's lives as well. And then there was an element of surprise, Sana, in your questions at the start as well, when you said that Supreme Court actually deciding, or Umer Saab was also saying this, that the Supreme Court deciding or taking over the job of Election Commission of Pakistan. That is old news. That has been happening. Regarding conflict of interest also, we know what is exactly happening at this moment. An example of how important cases are being heard, let us look at the cause list. For example, Justice Ijaz Hassan is actually hearing another case that is regarding suo motu of federal government employees, property related issues. And initially, Islamabad High Court had taken a suo motu and said that it is illegal, particularly in F14 and F15 sectors. And that also included, properties that are given to honorable justices of the courts as well. So Ijazul Hassan Saab is hearing that case as well. Similarly, if you remember that in the final days of PTI's government in Punjab, they also hired a lot of law officers, dozens and dozens of them. So Ijazul Hassan Saab is actually hearing that case also. Just see how it impacts the overall legal community and legal fraternity. So they have functionally, they have control over all the, buttons that might influence how legal community behaves in the coming days. So regarding, grace and honor and vindication, sorry, I ended up talking about vindictiveness, but vindication, all these matters are actually meaningless. Why? Because this whole case, everybody who says that a full court should have heard this case, let me be very clear, I don't agree with that idea. I say that the Honorable Supreme Court of Pakistan has overreached by actually stepping into the jurisdiction of Lahore High Court, where this matter was pending, where the judgment was already in exactly the same direction. There was only intra-court appeal. It would have been exhausted by now, and after that the matter would have culminated in the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court could have actually taken up the matter right now, because you keep on intervening in all these matters, and this is not the only High Court where you have intervened. And because you, you have more or less trust on the same ethnicity of judges, the other federating units keep on complaining what exactly is going on right now, right? For example, how many people were elevated from the, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa recently, Balochistan recently. In Sindh also, recently there was the matter of Supreme Judicial Council, but these matters were not referred there because the retiring Chief Justice of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa would have ended up on the panel. So if you look at all these elements, you realize that this is not what we are not talking about justice here. We are talking about prevailing of a certain mindset. And thankfully, today let us thank the Chief Justice for the choice of the date that he has chosen, because the man who was hanged ages ago on this date was the founder, was the creator of the Constitution. So this is not about Constitution, Sana. It never was, it never will be. It was never about holding the elections in this time or that time. Regarding another thing, I mentioned the difference between April and May. Let me give you an illustration. Remember when General Bajwa was getting extension? At that time, there was part of grapevine was that actually on that date, not one, but 2 4-star journals were retiring. And the other 4-star journal actually wanted that if there is going to be an extension, it shouldn't only be Bajwa who gets the extension, he should also get it, otherwise both should go home. And then there was some support of that point of view coming from the intelligence community as well. At that time, court actually put its foot down, and for days we kept on saying a federal government which is struggling, and we did not know who the status of army chief at that time. But then somebody actually mentioned this bit to General Bajwa. He allocated a replacement of the said journal, and that person actually went and took over. The moment that office was vacated, Sana, immediately the Chief Justice at that time in his hearing, just go back to the minutes of the meeting and you will be surprised. The language changes, the attitude changes, right? So the humble submission is whatever PTI has been banking on in the month of April, it is going to end in April. In April, you will get every kind of cooperation you want. In May, you will not, because there is going to be some change. And regarding this idea that Constitution does not offer any legal solution to the idea of 90 days, had the Chief Justice of Pakistan been retiring any time later than September, perhaps in December, I assure you that October 8 date would also have been included in the legal solution. Because at this time also, the Supreme Court has actually given out a solution which is not as according to the letter of the law. 120 days are not 90 days. At this moment, we are looking in the precipice. We are doing that because this court kept on playing, God with everybody.
Right.
So if you keep on telling me that I have to bow my head before anybody, yes, people like me, the working class people, are forced to bow their heads before every kind of traitor, every kind of dictator, every kind of power elite. So we'll do it, but my heart will never be in it. So
Right.
today this tamasha will continue, and 130 is not the barrel or the bottom of the barrel. We are going to sink further, thanks to these three gentlemen who has just actually told us that Nazariya Zarurat has been buried on the day when the founder of the Constitution was buried. Amazing kind of stories, right?
Right. Thank you, Farooq. Thank you, Farooq, for those comments. And thank you very much, Barrister Haris Azmat, for joining us. Thank you, Umer, Ijaz, Gilani, for being a part of the discussion as well. There are many questions, of course, still left unanswered, and we'll be, of course, talking more about what is going on. But at the end of the day, what one can hope for is a change in the right direction, and for all of this to lead somewhere where we can still talk about strengthening the system. Whether or not that happens, of course, still remains to be seen, but that is what one hopes for. Thank you. That's all that we have from the debate. We'll see you tomorrow.